Orders for textiles in Guangdong have plummeted by half, pushing the industry to the brink of crisis. Guangdong, as the final hub of China's textile supply chain and the world's largest fashion center, is now facing a serious order shortage. Take the Guangzhou Textile Import and Export Group as an example. Their business with the U.S. has shrunk by 50%, and profits are squeezed to the point where it's hard to breathe. They tried to pivot to domestic sales, but the sizes just don't match. It's really difficult. This year's textile off-season has arrived with even more intensity than usual. By June, the entire manufacturing industry has been engulfed in a chill. The overall operating rate is only 54%, and it's still dropping. Circular knitting machines are running at less than 40%, which means that nearly 60% of the machines are idle. Water jet looms are barely around 70%, and precision looms have slipped to just around 60%. In previous years, this bleak situation wouldn't have occurred until mid-July or even August. So what's happening in the market? Raw fabric is hard to sell, but factory warehouses are overflowing. As the high temperatures continue, the operating rate might be even halved even further. Textile factories in the Yangtze River Delta region, which mainly supply fabric for export, are facing a wave of shutdowns. According to the latest statistics, more than 30% of the factories in Keqiao, Zhejiang, have shifted to a 3 days on, 4 days off working model. In Guangdong, the volume of fabric returns has by 200% in a single day, and warehouse backlogs have exceeded industry warning levels. Recently, Chinese platforms have been flooded with discussions on the steep decline in the garment export industry. Due to high U.S. tariffs, the value of Chinese garment exports to the U.S. dropped significantly in May 2025, falling to $556 million, the lowest level in 22 years for a single month. According to the U.S. International Trade Commission, this figure not only marks a sharp decline from $796 million in April, but is also the lowest level since May 2003. It has dropped for the fourth consecutive month. This storm was triggered by the new U.S. tariff policies, which shattered the 20-year-old industrial chain that involved producing fabrics in China, making garments in Southeast Asia, and re-exporting them to the U.S. Experts predict that 90% of global textile companies are now facing tariff red lights. China's exports to the U.S. are expected to decrease by over 30%. Empty production lines and flashing shutdown alarms are signs of a historic restructuring of the International Division of Labor. For many years, China has been the main source of U.S. garment imports. However, with the ongoing deterioration in U.S.-China trade relations, China's position in the U.S. garment market is rapidly declining. Tariff measures have forced many U.S. brands and retailers to speed up supply chain restructuring and reduce dependence on Chinese factories. Garment companies are increasingly turning to other Asian regions such as Vietnam, Bangladesh, and India. Sheng Lu, a professor of fashion and apparel studies at the University of Delaware, pointed out the sharp decline in U.S. imports of Chinese garments in May 2025 is not a natural phenomenon. Although the U.S. and China have recently reached a truce in their trade war, reducing Chinese tariffs to 55%, Sheng Lu said that most major U.S. apparel companies still plan to further reduce their reliance on Chinese suppliers, and even consider completely withdrawing from the Chinese market. Meanwhile, the trend of shifting U.S. garment supply chains continues to accelerate. According to data from the auditing agency QIMA, in Q2 of 2025, U.S. companies' procurement from China decreased by nearly a quarter compared to the previous year, while procurement demand from Southeast Asia grew by nearly 30%. QIMA's report highlighted that the trend of U.S. companies moving supply chains out of China is not new. Southeast Asia's share in the U.S. supply chain has been steadily increasing since May 2023. However, the tariffs initiated by President Trump have clearly accelerated this process. Mexico has also become a beneficiary of the restructuring of U.S. supply chains. According to U.S. ITC data, in May, the total value of U.S. imports of garments from Mexico increased by 12% compared to the same period last year. At the same time, U.S. government tariff revenues reached a new high. In May 2025, U.S. tariff income totaled $24.2 billion, a nearly fourfold increase from last year, and over 25% higher than in April. This figure represents the first monthly statistic since the Trump administration implemented comprehensive tariff hikes in April. Some analysts believe this provides important short-term support for the U.S. government's finances. QIMA indicated that the coming months could prevent new challenges for the U.S. supply chain, as the tariff relief measures for most non-Chinese countries are set to expire, coinciding with the Christmas shopping season. Despite a 43% year-on-year drop in China's exports to the U.S. in May, with a decrease of $15 billion, official data shows that China's overall exports still grew by 4.8%. On May 7th, the Kobeissi letter cited official Chinese data indicating that China is working to adjust its trade flows, using third-party countries to bypass U.S. tariffs. Data shows that in May, China's exports to ASEAN countries grew by 15% year-on-year, and exports to the EU grew by 12%. Exports through Vietnam surged by 30%, and exports through Indonesia grew by 25%. Meanwhile, the US is blocking these backdoors. Recently, a new agreement between the US and Vietnam imposed a 40% tariff on goods exported from Vietnam, widely interpreted as a proxy trade war against China. Analysts pointed out that the recent trade agreement between the US and Vietnam is significant, as it delivers a heavy blow to the Chinese Communist Party. On July 3rd, President Trump reached an agreement with Vietnam's Communist Party General Secretary and President, making Vietnam the only country after the UK to reach a preliminary agreement on tariffs with the US. According to the agreement, the US reduced tariffs on Vietnamese exports to the US from 46% in April to 20%. However, goods from China that are illegally routed through Vietnam will face a 40% tariff. The US government has repeatedly accused Chinese companies of using Vietnam as a transit point to bypass tariffs. This includes sending goods to Vietnam for simple processing and then labeling them as made in Vietnam, or even briefly stopping at Vietnamese ports before shipping them out. They argue that despite these products having almost no added value in Vietnam, Chinese exporters can take advantage of lower tariffs on Vietnamese goods to bypass the high tariffs imposed on Chinese products. According to a document released by Vietnam's Ministry of Industry and Trade on July 3rd, the Vietnamese government is set to introduce a new decree with higher penalties for origin fraud and will implement stricter measures and inspections to prevent such fraudulent activities. The document states that Vietnamese authorities have been asked to intensify inspections of products exported to the US, with a focus on items at risk of trade fraud or those subject to trade protection measures by the EU and the US, particularly Chinese goods. The document lists wooden furniture, plywood, steel machinery parts, bicycles, batteries, wireless earbuds, and other electronic products. The document also highlights some fraudulent activities, such as using forged documents to obtain certificates of origin, falsifying origin certificates, and importing counterfeit goods into Vietnam. It adds that trade fraud activities have been increasing recently, mainly aimed at avoiding tariffs and trade protection measures. At the same time, there are still some details pending clarification in the US-Vietnam tariff agreement. It remains uncertain how Washington will define illegal transshipment, or how much value Vietnam must add to imported products to avoid a 40% tariff. There are reports that the US is urging Vietnam to reduce its reliance on Chinese imported components, particularly in electronics. Many experts have pointed out that although the US-Vietnam trade agreement may seem unrelated to China, it actually has the Chinese Communist Party worried. China expert Wang He stated, Trump's Tariff War 2.0 has a very clear goal: to cut off China's third-party exports to the US. In April, Trump announced global reciprocal tariffs, with 5 of the 10 countries imposing the highest tariffs being Asian nations, representing a full-scale attack on Beijing's extended supply chains. The trade agreement between the US and Vietnam will serve as a guiding model and may become the standard practice for future US trade agreements with other countries. Taiwanese economic expert Wang Sicheng stated, the whole world is closely watching the US-Vietnam trade agreement because everyone knows that Vietnam is the most important transshipment point for Chinese goods. The Chinese Communist Party has constantly warned the US not to impose a second-tier tariff, but unexpectedly, the latest US-Vietnam agreement still includes a second-tier tariff for transshipment points. Vietnam is a typical example, and countries that will likely reach trade agreements with the US in the future, if they are suspected of being transshipment points, will likely face high tariffs as well. What truly makes the Chinese Communist Party fearful is how Vietnam is going to be made an example. The model from the US and the UK is used as the template for the EU, while countries with industrial structures similar to Vietnam will use Vietnam as a model when negotiating with the US, thus creating a new precedent. It is worth noting that Vietnam's largest import trading partner is China, while its main export destination is the US. Vietnam has already become the largest transshipment point for Chinese products heading to the US. Since the first Trump administration, when tariffs were imposed on hundreds of billions of dollars of Chinese goods, trade between the US and Vietnam began to surge. Last year, the US trade deficit with Vietnam reached $123 billion US, making Vietnam the third largest trade deficit country for the US. On June 4th, US Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick testified before the Senate, stating, they buy $90 billion from China, then they mark it up and send it to us, so it's just a pathway of China to us. Researcher Huang Zongding at Taiwan's National Defense and Security Institute pointed out that the correlation between goods imported by Vietnam from China and goods exported by Vietnam to the US has now approached 100%. He explained, under the context of the US-China trade war during Trump's first term, on one hand, US-Vietnam trade relations have strengthened. On the other hand, Vietnam has imported large quantities of intermediate goods from China. This asymmetrical trade relationship has actually been deepening. During Trump's first term, 60% of the new transshipped goods to the US from Vietnam came from Chinese-owned enterprises in Vietnam. In fact, the transshipment tariff clause on Chinese goods has always been a key focus of US-Vietnam trade negotiations. On April 3rd, the US announced a 46% reciprocal tariff on goods from Vietnam. In response, the Vietnamese government held an emergency meeting aimed at addressing addressing U.S. concerns about illegal transshipment. During the meeting, the Ministry of Industry and Trade and customs officials were instructed to enhance supervision of illegal transshipment activities and to develop a new plan within 2 weeks. Vietnam has already taken a series of measures to crack down on transshipment of Chinese goods. However, since Vietnam relies on Chinese raw materials and equipment, the effectiveness of these measures remains uncertain. Wang He believes that if Vietnam truly enforces these measures, they will certainly be effective. He analyzed 2 scenarios. One, where Chinese products arrive in Vietnam, get relabeled as Vietnamese goods, and are exported. This would undoubtedly face severe penalties from the U.S. The other scenario involves Chinese machinery, equipment, and raw materials being sent to Vietnam for reproduction or reprocessing. According to international standards, if a product meets a certain level of local content in Vietnam, it can be considered a Vietnamese product and exported to the U.S. without issue. Wang He believes this depends on the details of the agreement between Vietnam and the U.S. regarding the determination of the origin of the products. One thing that is clear now is that under U.S. pressure, Vietnam must strictly enforce the law. Therefore, the practice of transshipping Chinese products through Vietnam is becoming increasingly difficult. Huang Zongding notes that before the U.S. and Vietnam signed the bilateral trade agreement in 2001, the average tariff on Vietnamese products entering the U.S. was 40%. Vietnam certainly does not want to return to the era of high U.S. tariffs. The U.S. has recognized the shared mindset of developing countries like Vietnam, which rely on the U.S. market for significant export profits. The U.S. has demanded that these countries, which benefit greatly from exports to the U.S., cooperate, and it seems that Vietnam, among others, have no choice but to comply. Some analysts have pointed out that Vietnam quickly reached an agreement with the U.S. and is willing to accept a 40% tariff on goods transshipped from China. This proactive attitude is impressive and reveals 2 key implications. First, as a communist country, Vietnam was almost the first to reach an agreement with the U.S., showing that Vietnam will unreservedly choose to align with the U.S. in the economic confrontation between the 2 countries. Second, by agreeing to the deal despite the imposition of second-tier tariffs on certain products, Vietnam is acknowledging the issue of transshipment of Chinese goods. It is evident that Vietnam is addressing this issue, and the tariffs imposed will ultimately fall on Chinese businesses. This point has been reflected and confirmed by Chinese businesses in Vietnam, who are currently feeling the chill. Vietnam's textile exports to the U.S. have plummeted by 25%, with some orders being directly cancelled. The volume of transshipment trade from other Southeast Asian countries has also dropped by 30%, and there's been a significant increase in cases of transshipment detected by U.S. Customs. In 2025, the U.S. imposed high tariffs on Vietnamese textiles, acting as a sharp pair of scissors, directly cutting off the invisible channel of transshipment trade in Southeast Asia. Behind this crisis is the collapse of the triangle trade chain, which will lead to the loss of orders in China's textile market. A business owner in Shenzhen revealed that, with the U.S. tightening its investigations into Chinese products, the channels for Chinese goods to pass through third countries are becoming increasingly difficult to navigate. Customs in Vietnam, South Korea, and Malaysia are working hard to block Chinese products. By June, this channel was becoming increasingly unfeasible. Analysts have noted that the recent performance of the garment industry is a microcosm of China's economy. However, labor-intensive products such as garments and furniture are not the main targets of Trump's tariff war. Electronic communication products, electric vehicles, large machinery, and shipbuilding industries are the main focus of his actions. While the garment industry has been significantly impacted, other targets under Trump's scrutiny are likely to suffer much more severely. For example, in the shipbuilding industry, after Trump returned to the White House, a series of measures targeting China's shipbuilding sector were introduced. Their effects are already becoming visible. In the first half of this year, new orders for Chinese shipyards have significantly dropped. The South China Morning Post reported on July 9th that as the U.S. steps up its efforts to weaken the dominance of Chinese shipyards, new orders for Chinese shipyards in the first half of 2025 have plunged. According to a recent report from maritime consulting firm Clarkson's Research, China remains the world's largest shipbuilding country, but new orders for its shipyards in the first half of the year have fallen by 68% year-on-year to 26.3 million deadweight tons. Analysts state that the shrinking market share for China is due to U.S. restrictions on China's shipbuilding industry and the overall decline in global demand. In addition to shipbuilding, China's shipyards have also seen a drop in market share for ship repairs and maintenance. In the 1980s, the U.S. abandoned its civilian shipbuilding industry. Asian companies gradually monopolized this market, initially Japan, then South Korea, and for the past 15 years, China has been the dominant player. After Trump began his second term, he launched a series of actions targeting China's shipbuilding industry, attempting to revive U.S. shipyards. In April of this year, the U.S. announced that it would impose high docking fees on any ships owned, operated, or built by Chinese companies that dock at U.S. ports. Additionally, the U.S. imposed high tariffs on Chinese-made equipment used by shipyards, such as cranes for unloading ships. Analysts say that China's domestic demand has not been effectively boosted, and relying on investment to drive economic growth has reached its limit. In this situation, the only driving force force for China's economy can only be exports. However, Trump is intensifying efforts to reshape trade rules, and trade agreements with dozens of global economies are about to be signed. A new tariff alliance centered around the U.S. is rapidly taking shape. Furthermore, Trump's targeted strikes on specific Chinese industries and products will undoubtedly make the already struggling Chinese economy even worse. For many Chinese industry professionals, 2025 is already shaping up to be the worst year, but perhaps this is just in comparison to the past.